This is a warning before you continue listening to this part. Chapter 20, Part 2 carries an 18-plus rating featuring vivid scenes of the Drazen eating, which the author describes in masterful detail. It's not for the faint-hearted, so if you'd like to skip to Part 3, it should be available now in the playlist. There will also be a link in the description below. Now, the black ship continues. The Drazen and Serhan were long gone by the time he stepped into view, and he froze when he saw the bodies of 6 adults lying on the ground, unmoving, and with lethal laser wounds on their bodies. He was staring at dead bodies. His stomach lurched and he tore off his helmet before he fell on all fours and puked. He breathed heavily for several moments before he heard the echoing movements of the aliens approaching. Panicked, he ran away as silently as he could without a direction in mind. His body did the work for him, and before he knew it, he was crawling through the same vent he and his friends had used to sneak into the bay in the first place. When he reached the end of the vent, he discovered the lid had been discarded, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw some blood on the floor and the arm of a dead body blocking his way. Without another choice, he pushed the arm away and stepped out of the vent, careful to avoid stepping on the pool of blood. Looking around the hallway, he saw a few scattered corpses. Most of them were adults, but he saw 2 that were not too long ago his classmates. How long had he been knocked out? Was everything he was seeing a nightmare? As much as he wanted that to be the case, he knew it wasn't. His head still hurt a little, and you couldn't get hurt in dreams. "Wisto?" he said softly, walking awkwardly as his steps squelched a little thanks to his pee. "Miss Carla?" No. A panicked cry caught his attention, and he turned to his left only to see 3 of his classmates run out of a bunk room down the hallway. A Drazen came after them, and he froze. The alien shot one of his classmates in the back, and he fell to the ground, shattering his helmet but didn't move again. The alien quickly caught up to the 2 remaining children and captured them with its vines, securing them tightly while they squirmed, cried, kicked, and did everything in their power to free themselves from its grip. Nothing worked. Wyatt felt his heart stop when the Drazen stopped to look down at him with 12 unblinking, lidless eyes. Then he felt a vine wrapping around him and he went limp. He didn't fight it. He was too scared to do anything else but allow his tears to fall. The trip to their ship was miserable. He had been shoved into a shuttle with 2 wounded adults and 8 of his classmates. Those were the living ones. He had seen with grotesque detail how the Drazen dragged bodies into their shuttles, piling them up without the least sense of care for the deceased. They had stripped him out of his suit and for some reason preserved his pee within it instead of tossing it away as they had done to many others. During the trip, no one talked. Drazen were watching over them, and the adults didn't dare to try and ease the frightened children for fear of angering the aliens. When he arrived at their ship, the stench was the first thing that hit him. The smell of rotten things was not new to him, but his experiences were nothing quite like the awfulness that he was smelling now. 2 vomiting classmates confirmed it was as bad as he thought. The Drazen, though, only shoved them forth. The interior of the alien ship was red, with protrusions of violet, green, brown, scarlet, and other shifting colors sticking out of the walls. For a moment he thought the walls were like meat, but the clinging made it obvious it was metal. The red lights above them were responsible for the interior's coloration. Unlike the blocky designs used on the Principality, the Drazen liked edges, sharp angles, and rounded, almost bulbous decorations throughout their ship. They continued to walk until they reached an intersection. The adults were forced to the right, while Wyatt and his classmates were forced to the left. One of the adults tried to protest, but a quick strike from a Drazen made her shut up. The scent of blood reached his nostrils as well as the stink of feces as they approached a larger, open section. When he entered, his heart sunk to his feet and his blood turned to ice. Hanging upside down like a dead Clixol was Waldya. She was naked, her feet were tied together, and she wasn't moving. She was dead. Her eyes were lifeless, staring at nothing, and her expression was frozen, showing pure terror. Her throat had been slit and blood trickled down into a large container. Next to her, several more of his classmates joined his now deceased friend. He noticed a series of tubes sticking to their bellies, and something flowing through them to who knows where. Waldya! he muttered in pure horror, his vision blurry as tears didn't stop pouring out of his eyes. "Wyatt!" The voice of Wantum caught him off guard, and he turned to his right, where Wantum stood with some of his other classmates, while Drazan examined them. "Wantum!" he wanted to cry out, but his voice was barely above a whisper. His eyes widened when a Drazan holding a beeping instrument unceremoniously broke Wantum's neck right in front of him. The death of his friend was the breaking point for his classmates, and they began to cry in terror, voiding their bowels in the process and trying to run away. The aliens simply held on to them or lashed them with their vines, pain overriding their sudden fear and panic. For his part, Wyatt could only watch as Wantum's body spasmed on the floor, gurgling for air that wouldn't come. A Drazan nonchalantly tore away his clothes and then picked him up, setting him up next to Waldia before slicing his neck, allowing his blood to flow freely. The tubes he'd seen earlier were then inserted into his belly, and liquid began to flow out of his body. Wyatt looked up when a shadowy figure set upon him only to find the same Drazan that had killed his friend. He stared at it, all emotion drained from his body, and then it moved to the side. Before he could process what had just happened, another Drazan urged him forth and away from that area. The young boy walked through pure inertia, his brain unable to process all the horrors happening around him quickly enough to form any coherent thoughts. All he knew was that he had been captured and that he was doomed. He didn't know for how long he walked, but when he reached his new destination, he was unceremoniously shoved into a holding cell where a dozen of his naked classmates huddled together in the back. Before the Drazan could remove his uniform and close the gate, an angry man shouted, fueled by rage and fury, "Go to hell!" An explosion followed his declaration, and the Drazan was sent flying back. Smoke, fire, and cries of pain and fear erupted like an orchestra. Wyatt covered his ears as the ringing pain of the explosion shook some sense into him, enough to see a few adults jumping on the other Drazan in the room, using their own claws to stab the aliens even as the Drazan slashed at them desperately. He was shoved to the side by his fleeing classmates. Seeing this as their only chance of freedom, they embraced it with reckless abandon. The young boy didn't think about anything. He just acted. Before reinforcements arrived, Wyatt broke into a run across the smoke-filled room while everyone was busy fleeing or fighting to pay him any attention. His keen eyes detected something through the smoke. It was small, but it was there. He would fit. The experience gained as a tracker didn't lie to him. He spotted a vent that had been torn open by the force of the explosion. He crawled inside it and moved away a few seconds before more Drazan arrived to quell the sudden uprising. Knowing that going back meant he'd join Waldia and Wantum eventually, he continued to crawl through the foul-smelling vent, moving slowly to avoid making any noise and evading any loud noise. His vision was blurry, his heart was pounding, and he couldn't control his ragged breathing. He didn't know how long he crawled through the vents, going from one direction to another, backing away, and getting lost in the maze of things until he found another vent without a lid on it. He cautiously approached, no longer breathing hard but still terribly terrified of being found, and saw a smaller room with no Drazan in sight. He found the courage to peek his head out, only to find that, somehow, during his time crawling through the vents, he'd made it to one that was close to the ceiling rather than on the floor. What he saw in that room would have made him vomit if he had anything in his stomach anymore. He'd seen more dead bodies being drained, so many dead bodies. He'd seen more of his classmates and other adults being killed. He was tired. His knees and hands hurt. He wanted to sleep, but he was too afraid to do it. The worst had been seeing a Drazan eating. Now he understood why they didn't have a mouth on their heads. Their heads weren't heads. He had no idea how that worked, it just did. Their tiny mouths, if they could be called that, were on their chests, and they opened up to reveal the true monster. It slurped on a bowl filled with a brownish oozing liquid. It fed slowly but greedily, clearly enjoying its meal. The colors of its petals swirled in exotic patterns that were beautiful to behold. How could something so pretty come from such a horrible monster? But now, he'd just discovered what the alien had been eating. There were pieces of human body parts scattered around several tables. Hands, legs, ribs, everything. On another table rested fine-cut pieces of meat, tendons and tongues. On yet another table there were bones, some half-crushed, and others resting inside a grinder. One another, a series of bowls with dirt in them rested peacefully. Wyatt choked up a scream when he made out the head of Miss Carla, and right next to her, the head of Wistow. His eyes filled with tears again, and he barely managed to bite his lower lip to stop himself from whimpering when he heard a door open. He backed from the edge slowly, but not enough to avoid seeing something that would be burned into his brain for all time. He watched, unable to look away either due to the horror of it all or because he simply couldn't avert his gaze as a Drazan prepared its meal. Pieces of meat were selected at random and cut into tiny pieces before being mixed with the dirt. Then it added blood drained earlier, piss, other strange fluids, and even some feces left behind by the frightened children, or the corpses. Casually, he plucked the eyes out of Miss Carla and Wistow's heads and added them to the bowl. It mixed it all diligently before finally grinding some bones, collecting the dust the process created only to then add it to the mix. After what felt like an eternity, the Drazan finished. The final product was that same brownish, oozing liquid he'd seen before. Then, the dreadful alien proceeded to eat, slurping the disgusting mix with gusto. Content with the result of its meal, it left the room and Wyatt was freed from the spell that forced him to watch that monster prepare a meal with the same air as his mother preparing supper. It was too much for the young boy. He passed out. Exhaustion, physical, emotional, and mental, finally crashed against him all at once. Time lost all meaning to Wyatt as hours passed like a blur. The distant cries of children and the defiant screams and curses of adults echoed throughout the vent he'd taken as his refuge. He was thirsty, hungry, and tired. So very tired. Every time he blinked and went to sleep, he relived the horrors he'd seen in such a short span of time over and over again. The lifeless eyes of his friends, teachers, and classmates beckoned at him, and it was all made worse when he recognized children from other schools. North Side, Everlake, Winterhome, Wingscale, and many others. Lord Serhan Geemore had kept his promise and sold the lives of so many in exchange for his own. It made sense, he told himself. He was a noble. It was his right. But he couldn't understand why he had done such a horrible thing. The Drazan, for their part, seemed to be jubilant about the abundance of food and cattle at their disposal, and Wyatt had to hear them and sometimes watch them do their butchery and feeding countless times, so much so that he couldn't cry anymore. He had seen the videos and read the warnings about the Drazan, and he had feared them just like any other kid his age did. But seeing the reality of their actions was so much worse. He wanted them to be cruel and monstrous like in the videos, eating people alive with their fangs, laughing at the torment of their captives. That would have been better over the casual mundanity they employed when dishing out death. They didn't torture anyone. They were not cruel. To them, he was an animal. Humans were animals that they could take and kill and feast upon as much as they liked because they could do it. But they could talk and understand them. They simply didn't care. Humans were not Drazan. As such, humans were inferior animals. It was a simple leap of logic that made terrifying sense even to the mind of a child. "Mom," he whispered softly, cracked lips trembling as he hugged his bruised legs and scrapped knees close. "Dad! Weskel! Wham!" he muttered, wishing more than anything to see his family again. He wanted to escape. He wanted to see their faces again and be safe in his bed, hugging his mother's legs and watching over his little brothers, playing with them. But he was in a vent, hiding away in fear while more and more died at the vines and stalks of the uncaring aliens. He was about to close his eyes again when he felt it. Something changed. There was an abrupt movement that made the vent rumble, the moistness of the air carrying with it a faint sound. Then another rumble, stronger, louder, closer. And suddenly the faint light that illuminated his hiding spot was gone. Fright gripped his heart. Had the aliens found him? He heard the shuffling of legs and bodies form a chaotic melody that reassured him that something else was happening. Fearful cries from children and the laughter of adults reached his ears while he was plunged into total darkness. Not knowing what else to do, he started to crawl. His uniform was dirty, grimy, and soiled. He had used part of it to cover his excrement when he couldn't contain it anymore. He was practically naked, and only his pants remained. stained red with the blood from his bruised knees. The palms of his hands also had blisters, and they stung badly. But at that moment he didn't care. He crawled for dear life, blinded for several minutes until a faint light returned. He crawled and crawled, moving away from the direction that exploded with gunfire and the sounds of battle. Had someone come to fight the Drazan? He crawled and crawled until something beneath him creaked. He had enough time to look down at a lid before it gave way beneath his weight. "Ah!" he screamed in surprise before landing on the cold, hard ground. He groaned in pain and rolled over to the side in an attempt to ease his aching chest and stomach. He blinked, dazed, and felt something warm trickling down his nose. The pain came a moment later, and he touched his injured forehead. The momentary dizziness passed, and he stood up, not knowing where he was. He quickly remembered that he was exposed, but there were no Drazan in the large room that was mostly empty, except for the 24 rows of tables containing some sort of willing plants. Above each sprout, there was a syringe drop, feeding onto them the same nasty ooze the Drazan ate. It took Wyatt 10 seconds to figure out that he had somehow landed in a nursery. On a corner next to a butchering table were several corpses piled up, and he choked at the sight. They were gray, already drained from all fluids. The shuffling steps of a Drazan snapped him out of his stupor. Moving without thinking, he moved to the only possible hiding spot. His stomach lurched, but that didn't stop him from shoving the corpses aside and wriggling his way beneath them. He was already used to the rancid, rotten meat smell of the ship, but the decaying bodies were a new experience from so up close, and he gagged, nearly puking whatever bile was left in his stomach. The door opened, and a Drazan rushed in, closing the gate behind it as it quickly turned to tend to the sprouts. Wyatt watched, hands covering his mouth, as the Drazan stopped abruptly, looking up to the vent and then down at the discarded lid and the blood he'd left on the floor. The young kid felt the hateful eyes of the Drazan turn to his hiding spot as its petals shone brightly with intense red, orange, and black shifting colors. It approached slowly while regularly peering from side to side for good measure. Wyatt was trembling hard, his eyes wide open as he watched the tall, horrid alien approach carefully. It stomped less than a meter in front of him, causing him to jerk back on reflex. The corpse above him shuffled, and that was enough reaction for the Drazan to strike. Faster than the eye could track, it lunged a vine at the corpse, piercing it from side to side. Wyatt closed his eyes, tears falling out as a gnashing pain tore at his left side across his ribs. He wanted to scream, but he was too afraid to even whimper. The Drazan retracted its vine and brought the claw-tipped end to its eyes, analyzing the fresh blood staining it. The colors of its petals swirled, and its vines bristled in anger. It shoved the corpses out of the way only to find him there, cowering amidst corpses and looking up at the alien with unbridled terror. The door opened at that precise moment. The Drazan turned to face the interlopers and received a deluge of bullets in response. It then slumped to the floor, dead, bleeding yellow and dark ichor onto the metal floor.